There are the anyway climate solutions, which are economically good choices anyway. And there are the because climate solutions, which really are only in today's policies because they reduce emissions. And if you have to figure out how to manage your risk in a volatile legislative, administrative, and political context, you probably want to focus on the anyway options, those things that work anyway. And so when we break down where the coalitions will stand, they'll probably stand around things that people already supported.
Hello and welcome to Energy 360, the podcast from the CSIS Energy Security and Climate Change Program. I'm Quill Robinson. This week, we discuss the role of energy and climate change in the 2024 presidential election. Kevin Book of Clearview Energy Partners helps us understand the implications of the dizzying last few weeks in American politics, as well as the market and policy trends to watch as November 5th approaches. Let's dive in.
The 2024 presidential election is less than 4 months away. At the Republican National Convention, Donald Trump secured the GOP's nomination after surviving an assassination attempt just a few days prior. Senator J.D. Vance, the freshman senator from Ohio, was selected as the VP nominee. On July 21st, President Joe Biden announced that he is not running for re-election. Vice President Kamala Harris appears on track to secure the Democratic nomination for president at the DNC in Chicago later this month. To break down the climate and energy policy implications of the election, I'm happy to welcome Kevin Book, who is Director of Research and co-founder of Clearview Energy Partners, and also a non-resident senior advisor here at CSIS. Thanks for joining me, Kevin.
Quill, it's good to be here.
All right. So, Kevin, your firm has published a report that says that this year's presidential race is going to be an energy election. I want to start there. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's an interesting question to ask when both parties are claiming that the other is an existential threat to democracy. But what we mean by that is really two things. The first is energy going to influence the election outcome? And the second is, will the outcome of the election impact energy? Our answers to both of those, just as spoilers, yes and yes. And that was true before all the events you mentioned. But to the first one, energy's really become a wedge issue over recent years. And sort of following from that, the two different policy platforms are quite disparate, even though that's surprising. And I think that reflects some combination of both fundamental and political reasons.
Let's look back over the last 20 years or so. And can you walk us through how energy did become a wedge issue and how that's evolved?
Well, it's interesting if you go back, you don't have to go back 20, you can go back 16 or so to the McCain-Obama election. And you had two candidates who were both for putting a price on carbon and also for drilling for more oil. Maybe not in the same order, but both at the same time. And that was a function of scarcity. At a time of great scarcity, we were importing about 30% of what we consumed on a net basis. We'd just come out of what was then nominal peak gasoline prices. And not consuming hydrocarbon also meant not emitting carbon dioxide. So there was an alignment, a natural alignment, really, between sort of the consuming less for environmental reasons and the producing more for security reasons. Producing it here might have also had a lower emissions impact. So that alignment continued, actually, sort of the trend of energy becoming more insecure and emissions rising that we'd seen from the beginning of the decade, then flattened. And of course, as fracking started to crack the matrix and get more molecules out of the rocks, we displaced the imported gas with our own gas and displaced coal with our gas. And we ended up increasing our energy security and lowering our emissions. And these two things aligned. So it was very easy for McCain and Obama to be talking about the same thing in 2008, same things. But in 2012, those two trend lines start to scissor apart. You essentially see emissions bobbling about at roughly the level they've been at since then. Well, net imports fell. We became a net exporter in 2019, and we're now an 11% of consumption net exporter. And so you can't argue that the incremental barrel provides the same environmental benefit. And so just on a very fundamental basis, if you just look at those two things and say, well, these two trends that moved together moved apart, maybe that would be enough. But there's also some very pronounced partisan divisions. And you may ask, like, why does drill, baby, drill resonate so much with red state voters? Not all of them, after all, are from places that produce oil. And one of the reasons is probably on the consuming side, economically. If you look at those red states, if you think about them sort of locally, the 23 states with all red governments, governors and legislatures, they are about 1 percentage point out of pocket more on the energy they spend at a household level than the blue states, the 18 all blue states.
So this really has to do with the consumption side, less so with the fact, Florida is not a hub of oil production, but it has, certain Republican states are really thinking about the consumption side and the impact of energy in that regard.
Well, 100% of American voters are energy consumers.
Right.
I'll start with consumption, but I wouldn't rule out production as well. It's just that, as you say, Florida is not an oil state in a production sense. They're an oil consuming and importing state. But if you look at the red states from a production standpoint, that's also where they come in large. There's a resonance there for producers. About 70% of our onshore fossil energy production is happening in those 23 red states. About 52% of our electricity production, even though it's 37% of GDP in those 23 states. So very carbon intensive, very energy intensive, very production intensive. But they feel it in their pocket more. And I think that's where the drill, baby, drill resonance probably still sort of triggers a more positive response in those states. If you think about why they feel it more, it's because, first of all, the disposable incomes are lower on average in those states. They're driving longer distances in fleets that are more truck intensive. 60% of the household energy spend is basically motor fuels. That message probably gets through.
Right. Here in Washington, D.C., we have a much different relationship to energy and gas prices than those in, say, rural Wyoming. So you talked about some of the fundamentals that were at play and some of the structural changes that have happened over the last couple of decades. Could you talk more about, why energy fundamentals are important in this election? And even though we're not getting a rematch of 2020, perhaps compare some of the differences in fundamentals between 2020 and the 2024 election this year.
Well, prices as a share of disposable personal income are about where they were at 2016, gasoline prices. So is that the makings of an energy election? The answer is, well, probably it keeps the topic top of mind. Both parties are going to talk about it. Republicans are going to talk about the increase from the COVID troughs, and Democrats are going to talk about how the President Biden, has unusually, really, I think uniquely, taken ownership of gasoline prices for the end user and said, we're keeping the price low for the consumer. So gasoline prices, part of the discussion. But very prominently, $1 trillion or multi-trillion dollar outlay for green spend is going to put the issue on the table as well. And if you could call that a climate election or an energy election, but really, if you think about it, to have that climate discussion, for President Biden to campaign on what was the greenest platform in presidential history, part of what de-risked that campaign pitch was that energy prices were so low as a share of disposable personal income in the 2020 cycle. So it wasn't freaking voters out quite as much as it might. That price backlash that we've seen against climate policies, both in Europe and here, when prices have risen, can be toxic to some of those political messages. And it wasn't present then. And that, I think, set the stage for what would become the Inflation Reduction Act, the Build Back Better Act originally, and the Green Campaign. Finally, in terms of the fundamentals, we are a net exporter of energy at this point. And part of what that has done is it's put BTUs into the world that have buffered global price volatility. For that reason, to some degree, it leaves room, it leaves space to have climate discussions. We're really in the middle of two wars in energy adjacent regions or energy producing regions in the world right now, and finding prices relatively comfortable.
So that's quite interesting. I think we often hear this narrative that young voters who turned out in droves and record numbers in 2020 really demanded of Biden that he lead on this issue of climate change. But you're saying that, perhaps some of the structural elements and the relatively low energy prices at that time allowed for him to do that at the same time, created the wiggle room to do that. So related to gas prices, we often hear that the solution to gas price volatility is electric vehicles. EVs, interestingly, have come up as a real friction point in the 2024 election. President Trump has been very, very critical of the EV provisions within the IRA. Why is it the EVs have become so political?
There's a couple of data points I'd offer on that one. The first one would be that the EV tax credit, the 30D Clean Vehicle Credit, was created in 2008 in October in the same bill that created the Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP. And at the time, it was a bipartisan bill, the Emergency Economic...
Wait, Kevin, say that again. It was a bipartisan bill that created the EV tax credit. It was a bipartisan bill, yeah. Both Democrats and Republicans were shell-shocked by high gasoline prices, and they wanted a diversification option. Diversification had bipartisan support earlier in that decade. The Congress had said, let's put new fuels in old cars. Let's put ethanol into the gasoline mix because we need diversification. Let's make those old cars more efficient, new cars using old fuels more efficiently. And then in 2008, they said, let's put new fuels in new cars. Let's come up with electrification of transportation as a diversification choice. So everyone could agree on that. However, climate change had been a contentious issue with a lot of partisan overtones already by then. And when the Obama administration came in, they reframed electric vehicles really more as a decarbonization choice. And the decarbonization choice also involved setting some fairly stringent fuel economy standards. To some degree, what that did is it empowered California to have a lot of sway over national policy because of California's unique position within the Clean Air Act. Section 209B gives it the ability to set standards that are more stringent and other states to adopt it under Section 177. This power and those standards became a target of the Trump administration when it came in. And suddenly EVs were really as much about going after a Democratic stronghold
right? The Trump administration was trying to overcome that California standard setting ability and also to some degree taking a shot at California. So you have a political overtone that is growing. Now, as we go forward from there, those fuel economy standards, the EV credits, we have an evolution of an EV sector, which is starting to really sell a number of cars, not just first early adopter vehicles, but actually, is a more widespread diffusion. But where are they going? Well, they're being driven in large part by state policies. And if you look at where we are today, the penetration in the fleet in the blue states is about 3 times what it is in the red states. And that's probably not just a function of the longer driving distances, but also that those politics in those states mapped to policies that made vehicle adoption more attractive, and maybe also that voter preferences reflected it. So where are we now? Well, if you look at what happened when prices spiked in the early days after the war, Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm said something very interesting. She said, we would be much more able to cope with these high prices if we electrified our transportation. What we need to do is diversify away from the variable cost dependency from globally sourced hydrocarbons into something else. So, of course, that something else turns out to be a fixed cost risk that comes from transition metals and minerals. That issue is now a little bit divisive as well. I think, though, if you look at it, we are electrifying transportation. We continue to do so. The people who can afford the cars buy the cars. And there is one very prominent maker of electric vehicles who seems to have taken a political side since the assassination attempt on former President Trump.
An interesting point there, too. Half of all of Tesla's EVs are actually globally are produced in Shanghai as well. So that's very much entangled with the geopolitical competition that is happening here. The criticism we often hear is that from Republicans is that the transition to EVs has sort of gotten ahead of itself. Do you think that that's an accurate characterization?
Well, I think there was a Bloomberg headline, I think a year or two ago, that said something like, EVs are no longer for the uber rich, they're now for the Uber driver.
It's a very good line.
It's a terrific line. I compliment them. I love me a good title. At Clearview, we spend we spend an appropriate amount of time. I would never say we have long discussions about titles. The idea, though, that the one percenters, the sort of the people who could afford second vehicles were buying these as curiosities and using them maybe 1/3 as much was not a mass market. But the Uber driver, I think their implication in the title was now, here we go, we're on the cusp of mass market. Except the Uber driver is sort of the 1%er of vehicle miles traveled. The Uber driver can afford the higher fixed cost increment and make it back on variable cost, right? Because they're going to drive many, many more miles. For those of us who use our vehicles 5% of the time and the other 95% of the time they're storage lockers for kid stuff, that's not necessarily an economic proposition that's going to work. And when we look at consumer choice, what are we really asking EV drivers to do? Well, we're asking them to essentially pay more so that they can drive less and fuel longer. Again, that works in some cases and in some places, but there might have been other modalities, other diffusion pathways that would have worked more closely with what people were looking for. Plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, for example, which combine 2 different energy sources for the same new platform, would transition away from hydrocarbon-based and internal combustion-based engines, but preserve backwards compatibility to the 150,000 gasoline stations that are available, assuming that the plug-in came with a range extender that would provide for that backup generation as needed. So it's not clear that we're at the mass market point. And lo and behold, the automakers are realizing it.
Certainly. And it also, from a consumer perspective and a mass market perspective, it certainly matters who is buying these EVs, but also from a decarbonization perspective as well. If this is a second or third car versus a primary vehicle, I think that's quite consequential in terms of the decarbonization potential of electrifying transportation.
Like the difference between a virtue signal and a turn signal.
Indeed.
They're not the same thing.
Indeed. Another element of this that I feel like is often lost in the U.S. conversation is we're very focused on these consumer side tax credits, and that's kind of turned into a culture war issue. But there's also the economic competition piece of context here when it comes to China. I feel like most Americans have never heard of BYD before. How should we be thinking about, in the context of this election and beyond, the geopolitical and economic competition element of EV manufacturing?
Well, there are meaningful global alliances that are formed around energy and energy technologies. Not just energy supply, but for example, nuclear technologies tend to produce alliances as second-order benefits or consequences, depending on how you look at it and which technologies we're talking about. EVs also provide some degree of reciprocality, and like all vehicle trade, there's opportunities there. The problem is whether we are well-positioned to capture markets. It's also a question whether some of our allies in Europe are well-positioned. In both cases, you have manufacturers who are dependent on supply chains that reside, at least parts of those supply chains, reside at a very high level of concentration in China. So they don't actually disaggregate the sovereign national security argument for electrified transportation away from the increasing strategic competition of the moment. And at some level, you have the German car sector, for example, is a center of excellence for internal combustion engines, which I think is why Volker Wissing last year, the transportation minister, sort of threw a flag and said, wait, what if we keep an opening for synthetic fuels, for e-fuels in internal combustion vehicles, rather than phasing these things out entirely? And so I'm not sure that we're at the point where the countries that are really responsible for the historical manufacture of internal combustion engine vehicles are fully positioned right now to take advantage of the transition opportunity. And whether or not the strategic vulnerabilities that creates, whether they be computer-based or resources-based, that question's being wrestled with right now. And the answers are, well, it's hard to build a factory. It's hard to set up a mine here in the United States. And part of the reason it is that during the heyday of globalization, we tightened our environmental belts as we outsourced our heavy industry. And now we're talking about bringing it home, and the belt's still very tight.
Right. We certainly hear a lot about $7,500 tax credits going to rich Californians. I feel like I'm not hearing enough about Stuttgart or Detroit in the future being in Shanghai. That might put a little bit of a different spin on this EV conversation here in American politics.
Well, on that, just to be clear, Georgia, for example, Tennessee, a lot of the states that are not necessarily what you would think of as the blue transition forward states, like California, are also hotbeds of economic activity. They've become major recipients of post-IRA EV battery and EV technology investment announcements, at least, and in some cases, investments.
We've talked a lot about President Trump. We've talked a lot about President Biden's legacy. How far do you think that Kamala Harris would push the green agenda if she was elected president this fall?
Well, every president's constrained by really three things: circumstances and calendars and the courts. And if you look back at what happened to the Biden administration, they came from a very green rest state. They came into transition, and you had war in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East, a lot of factors that forced a pragmatism. Actually, it's interesting. If you think about where a Biden administration might have gone in the second term with President Biden, he wouldn't have been running for re-election. So some of that re-election-based end-user cost pragmatism might not have been there. He might have been willing to go further. So it's very hard to say right now what a Harris administration might do because we don't have any recent data points. And I think extending the existing agenda and defending it is sure to be the first priority because that's what the continuity case is all about. But when you think about what she'll be up against if she's president, she'll be thinking about re-election the same way Biden was. And so there's some prospect she too could be pushed back towards the center, despite the demonstrable data points towards a progressive leaning that have shown up in all the media reports, her co-sponsorship of the Green New Deal, her anti-fracking stance. I'm not sure either of those is particularly predictive of where she would be today. And in any case, I think that re-election pressure could have a moderating influence of wherever she might want to go.
I want to talk a little bit more about how this election could influence the energy sector. We've talked about how energy is influencing this election, but we're hearing a lot of different rhetoric right now. But what are some of the main impacts that we should be considering as we think about how this 2024 election will impact the energy sector?
Well, in our election report, which, given the events of the last week or so, you always want a chance to try to update things dynamically, but you have to print them statically.
I'll note for our listeners that this is our third attempt at recording this podcast. Hopefully
the world just keeps changing, Quill. Can we hit pause? So in our election report, I think, and as we've done in the past, it's often more useful to think about the change versus continuity division rather than sort of, one candidate or the other, because continuity is an essential part of a regulatory legacy. If you have 2 consecutive terms in today's presidency, you have the opportunity to defend the rules that were proposed and finalized in the first term. Whereas a new president coming in has a range of opportunities, whether through the Congressional Review Act, if the Congress is aligned with the new president, to roll back some of the rules that were more recently finalized.
An example of this might be the Keystone XL pipeline, which has sort of been a hot potato going back and forth between administrations.
Well, that was done essentially by executive action. But for example, the 2020 methane rule, the policy rule that the Trump administration finalized, was rolled back by the Biden administration using the Congressional Review Act because the Democrats had a majority in both chambers of Congress and it was available to them to do it. There's other rollback modalities too, a lot of them, legislatively as well as administratively. That continuity is very important. Essentially, the starting point for the analysis is that if Harris, or we presume it's going to be Harris at this point, and whoever she picks as her vice presidential nominee, and maybe by the time this comes out, we'll know that too, that will provide for defending and extending the Biden platform as it stands today. Whereas really the deregulatory options, the range of deregulatory options available to the Trump administration would take a lot of the time in a single term. And it raises questions about what Republicans might do to try to speed things up.
To that point, President Biden's 4 years in office was historic when it comes to climate and energy legislation. Through the IIJA and the IRA, we've seen hundreds of billions of dollars of capital be catalyzed and go into both manufacturing and deployment of clean energy technologies. There's this big question now of what is going to happen to these laws, particularly the IRA. President Trump has talked about ending the Green New scam. Are we looking at a complete IRA rollback or maybe not?
So let's talk generally then specifically. Generally, I think what you can expect are higher domestic protection walls. So to the extent that there are parts of some of these credits that have domestic content regulations, the idea that the Biden administration has been going with is sort of, we want this, but not yet. So they've had end arounds that have provided ways to decarbonize now while deglobalizing later. Our suspicion is that a Trump administration reinterpreting rather than rescinding outright these credits, which we think is more likely, would then infuse them with a greater, more protectionist type of sentiment. Sort of, that's the starting point for that, but maybe not get rid of them entirely. The second thing is we've lost Chevron doctrine. And actually, some of the features, some of the interpretations that came from the Biden administration may have diverged. Outgoing Senate Energy Chairman Joe Manchin has made a point of enumerating the ways in which interpretations might have diverged from the statutory intent. And so a reinterpretation by the Trump administration that strips some of the apparatus away. So diving into a couple specifics, the 3 pillars in the 45V hydrogen credit, which hasn't yet been finalized, and who knows if they'll actually still be there in the end. But the additionality or incrementality, as well as the deliverability and temporality provisions, they're not in the statute. Would they be there if Trump got a shot at revising those rules? And our thought is maybe not. How would we interpret what a coal community or an energy community looks like? Would it be as broadly interpreted as in the Biden interpretation of the bonus credits for wind and solar? Or would it be narrower? Our suspicion is that it might be narrower. What would we see on the 30D credit? Again, probably higher domestic walls. But the alternative to the 30D credit, the electric vehicle credit, is a commercial leasing credit, which has none of those restrictions. And that interpretation was taken by the IRS to allow the 45W credit to provide leases to function as a sort of an end around to the, first of all, the income limits. So the $300,000 household limit on qualifying for the $7,500 credit, the vehicle price limits, to the extent this is a rich person's rebate, the 45W opens up some of those vehicles, and then all the domestic content and foreign entity of concern provisions that are built into it. So when we dig into some of these specifics, I think you can find a renovation, but not an outright rollback of the IRA. In the end, if we assume that Trump is working with a bicameral majority in the House and Senate if he wins, and that is the assumption we take in our change case for discussion purposes at this point, then you have a couple of modalities available as well. One is to make those changes not through the regulatory process, which can be time consuming, but to use a reconciliation bill in the budget reconciliation process, filibuster proof, or maybe even renovate the legislative filibuster. But that's a whole separate kettle of fish.
So you've outlined a number of procedural challenges here. There are also probably some coalitional issues as well within the Republican Party on things like nuclear energy and carbon capture and perhaps critical mineral supply chains, which are all supported by the IRA and IIJA. Perhaps there are some challenges getting all Republicans in line to go after the broader Biden climate agenda.
You're absolutely right. And it's a great question. We've been getting it from clients for more than a year. In the end, if I distill it down to sort of the postcard version, it goes back to something I wrote here at CSIS in 2017. There are the anyway climate solutions, which are economically good choices anyway. And there are the because climate solutions, which really are only in today's policies because they reduce emissions. And if you have to figure out how to manage your risk in a volatile legislative, administrative, and political context, you probably want to focus on the anyway options, those things that work anyway. And so when we break down where the coalitions will stand, they'll probably stand around things that people already supported. If you're going to be doing a fossil energy project and it's more efficient because of efficiency gains that are built in, if you're going to move sort of horizontally to new space, then maybe it's going to be something for which companies already have core competencies. You'll see support for that. If you're drilling wells, for example, then other extractive processes might be available to you. Incentives for minerals might stand the test. Some of the other more because type options might not.
All right, I want to bring us back to fossil, 80% of our energy system. President Trump has reiterated his call to drill, baby, drill, a good Sarah Palin shout out there. What would that actually mean? We are the number one producer of oil in the world, number one producer of gas, number one exporter of LNG. What does drill, baby, drill mean in 2024?
Well, a certain amount of that drilling is going to depend on investor appetites and global supply-demand balances. So what the federal government controls in large part is access to production on federal lands, the permitting of it, and then the transportation of that energy out of those federal lands or through them if the energy originated somewhere else. With regard to the access, Trump would almost certainly try to rewrite the 5-year offshore oil and gas leasing plan, which currently has 3 lease sales. The permitting reform bill proposed by Chairman Manchin and Ranking Member Barrasso would upgrade that to 5 sales within sort of the current interval as a minimum. And legislatively, that's the kind of thing right away you'd expect to see an attempt to move production on federal lands faster, again, subject to the appetites of a capital-disciplined upstream sector. It gets more complicated when it comes to actually moving things out or through. Transportation and permitting issues, probably a relaxation of some of the interpretations of NEPA back to where the Trump administration status quo ante was before the Biden administration regulation. Some of them were esoteric ways to approach it. And maybe also a different approach on methane, a different approach on emissions regulation. It's not clear how that'll shake out. But to the extent that there are some operators who face non-maintenance capital obligations that could be quite significant, removing those regulatory burdens from those operators could be an objective of the Trump administration.
Kevin, before we wrap up here, I want to ask you about green industrial policy. I think the pick of J.D. Vance as President Trump's VP nominee was quite interesting. He is not a Reagan Republican, certainly not a Paul Ryan Republican. He's been quite vocal about using tariffs, as has President Trump, the hand of the government to tip the scales in the favor of American industry. Do you think that there actually is a potential bipartisan path forward for policy that sort of centers around this idea of industrial policy? Maybe if we say the green part quietly to our Republican friends?
Well, I think they will talk more about the anyway parts of the green part than the because parts of the green part. That was true in the first Trump term. So if we see a second Trump administration, yes, I think that, first of all, what we saw was a very muscular, at the time we termed it command capitalism from the Trump administration. And if you looked at what Trump tried to do on energy in his first term, some of what he was trying to do, he negotiated directly with OPEC Plus, for example, in an energy ministerial after the oil crash in 2020, talked specifically to President Xi in China about making purchases, including energy, talked with the EU about coming up with a trade bargain to buy more LNG, although it wasn't ever really inked in any sort of explicit way and driven more really by market forces. I think where we are is that we're at a point in history where already because of a fragmentation of the global system, facing off of, call it a Western G7 NATO alliance against a Shanghai Cooperation Organization / BRICS type member state combination, however you want to divide it, we're at that point in the world where governments are taking an active role in the West, unblushingly, unflinchingly, saying industrial policy is something that's good. Don't expect that to change just because the presidency does. And the energy aspects of that, probably not either. One sort of aftershock of the IRA and the fiscal stimulus that preceded it in the Great Recession is protectionism. We saw that already in the first Trump term. And I think industrial policy, in terms of stimulating investment, is one flavor, but protecting that investment is another flavor. And so I think industrial policy may beget more industrial policy, really no matter who wins. And the question will be what form it takes. Last thing to say on that, Trump, the tariff man, if he were back, has proposed another tariff. I wouldn't rule out the possibility that Republicans might be willing to, as you said, say the green part quietly and look at border adjustments for carbon intensity.
It's a completely different paradigm than when An Inconvenient Truth in 2006 was released. We are no longer in this world of free trade and unrivaled American hegemony and free markets. I think it's quite remarkable. And I think it's certainly something that folks in the climate community need to pay attention to because we're working in a completely different context now. Kevin, so finally, what else could happen in this change scenario? What else should our listeners be paying attention to that may emerge over the next several years?
Well, I think it's the broader geostrategic context that's still very important. 80% of our energy, as you say, is fossil energy in the world. Really, it's right and appropriate to look at the green wave. Captures a lot of attention and should, but take away that 80% fossil energy ocean and it's just a puddle. So talk about that ocean for a minute. We have sanctions right now in place against major oil and gas producing nations. This is something that was only made possible really by the energy that we put into the world through fracking. We find ourselves in a number of global conflicts where we've chosen to engage through economic force projection. And as a weapon, we're using tariffs and sanctions and prohibitions on investment and export controls. And those are all potentially subject to change. For example, it's possible that if we had a Trump presidency, the change scenario might include more Russian molecules because of a settlement in Europe, or at least those molecules following more expeditious paths once again.
Because they still seem to be moving around the world despite
They do, although they're taking the long way. They're taking the long way, so it's been good for bunker fuel demand, and I suppose bad for bunker fuel emissions, depending on how you look at it. In any case, so more Russian molecules maybe taking the fast lane, and maybe fewer Iranian molecules. We have to think about the sort of way in which we've built this geostrategic economic force projection paradigm and how it could change. When we look at the frictional impacts of tariffs in general on demand, that could be quite significant. So if we are really in a place where a 10% across the board tariff is in the offing, then we very well could find ourselves looking at an entirely different demand paradigm against a world of new supply, a lot of it green, that's been going to satisfy fast growing demand so far. And as we think about reshoring strategic industries, the question of how we're going to do that, particularly how we're going to get clean energy minerals and metals with clean title that meet our objective set of social and environmental standards here in the United States, that will be on deck for that sort of broader geostrategic discussion too. Because as you mentioned earlier, so much of that centers around our relationship with China.
Kevin, thank you so much for joining me. Appreciate you giving us our insights and look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks for having me in.
Thanks to Kevin for his insights. The CSIS Energy and Climate team will continue to follow the 2024 election and analyze its market and policy implications. You can find more episodes of Energy 360 on our website, csis.org, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Follow us on social media for updates from our team, and as always, thanks for listening.